Hello, welcome to Kcse English. In today's episode, we are going to look at Kcse Paper 2 Poetry, how to master poetry and how to answer poetry questions in Paper 2. Students, it's important for you to distinguish between Paper 1 poetry and Paper 2 poetry. Paper 2 examines you more on mastery of poetry and the skills that are required in poetry writing. Welcome again. My name is Brenda Midika. Paper 2 Poetry. This is a poem that you will be examined on that is presented in Paper 2. Remember that this is an unseen poem. And so what you need to do is that you need to prepare adequately. The poems might be the poems that you have read, the poems that you have not read, the poems that are outside our environment, or sometimes the poems that we can relate to. It is important for you, therefore, to master very, very important aspects. Number one, it is important you to distinguish what is a poem. Remember, we said that poem is an art that is written and it is presented in stanzas and lines. Very important for you to learn that. Again, remember we say that poems are presented in a way that is pleasing and in a way that you really need to think about it critically. We might have simple poems, but we might have poems that require you to think critically. Therefore, what are some of the questions that you will be asked in KCSE Poetry Paper 2? Number one, the poem might ask you to describe the persona. The persona is the voice that is speaking in that poem. Remember, the persona can be a driver, the persona can be a child, the persona can be a father or a mother, the persona can also be an observer. So, read the words carefully as you try to find out who is the persona, who is speaking in that poem. Distinguish between the persona and the poet. The poet's name usually appears after the poem has been written. But the persona is that person whose voice we can hear in the poem. Secondly, the second question that is commonly asked is, what is the subject matter of the poem? What is the theme of the poem? We are looking at the overriding message in the poem. For example, a poem might be addressing corruption. A poem might be addressing childhood memories. A poem might be addressing human labor. A poem might be addressing child labor. A poem might be addressing boy-child issues. A poem might be addressing female assertiveness. A poem might be addressing parenting. There are so many themes that the poem will be talking about. And so, as a student, you need to identify what is the message, the key message. Again, look at the title of the poem. It might also be leading you to getting an insight to what the message is in the poem. Sometimes a question can come, what is the poem about? I always encourage students to read each stanza and try to analyze what is coming from each stanza and then come up with a paragraph that explains what the poem is talking about. So it's important for you to internalize each stanza, and after you have internalized each stanza, you can therefore go and now start writing what the poem is about. So those might be two different questions. Another commonly examined question would be, what is the character trait? Questions that are talking about the characterization of the characters in the poem. So again, identify who are the characters in the poem, what is going on in their lives. Remember, just like other literary works, a poem is a creative work that has characters. And so try to find out who are these characters and give them appropriate character traits. Some three important aspects that are commonly examined: tone, mood, and attitude. You need to distinguish tone, mood, and attitude and to find out which adjectives can be used to describe each. Remember, we have said that mood is the overriding feelings in the poem. Attitude, these are the feelings towards the persona, towards what is being discussed, towards something in the poem. So distinguish all those. And then lastly, the tone, the quality of the voice that is speaking in the poem. So you need to identify which are the adjectives. Is it a cheerful tone? Is it a sad tone? Is it a melancholic tone? Is it a solemn mood? Is it a somber mood? Is it an anxious mood? You need to look at the adjectives that you can use to define to describe the three: tone, mood, and poetry. We define them using adjectives. What are the feelings that you're getting? What are the feelings of the persona towards what they are talking about? And what is the voice? How is the voice? How is the voice coming out? Is it a harsh tone? You need to read, ask questions, do practices. And another question that you will likely find out: what is the meaning of these phrases, or what is the meaning of these words in the poem? Again, here you will not have a dictionary, but what do you need to know? How to derive meaning from the context that you're working with. So if you are talking about child labor, try to find out what are some of these words, what do they mean in this context, so that you get the right answers to answer to your questions. It is important, students, to also revise and get exposed to as many questions as possible. One other question that is commonly examined is: what are the stylistic devices in the poem? That can be a general question. Another question can be: what are the figures of speech that are used in this poem? What is the imagery that is used in this poem? You need to revise and find out: what are stylistic devices? What is figurative language? What are figures of speech? And what is imagery? Remember, as a poet, you want to create as many pictures, mental images in the mind of the speaker. And so, poets are likely to use different stylistic devices, from similes, metaphors, hyperbole, um, hyperbole, irony, satire, sarcasm, all those different stylistic devices. You need to learn how to identify and how to illustrate. I would like you to learn that questions in poetry will be asking you: identify and illustrate and show the effectiveness. Identify means then you are to pick the specific aspect that you are being asked in the poem. Then you say what it is about. And lastly, you show the effectiveness. Why has a certain stylistic device been used? Some of us students have a we have a way of answering questions which are very poor. Remember, that question comes in three ways. You identify the stylistic device, it is irony. Then I illustrate the irony. Remember, when we use the irony, we are using contrastive terms like you will talk about yet, however, it is expected that this should be done. So you need to learn how to identify, illustrate, and then lastly, show us what has been achieved using the irony. Has it that the message has been achieved more? Is it that the imagery, the mental images have become more created in the mind of the speaker? Or how does that stylistic device help in the delivery of the message of the poem? Let us consider that poetry might have some of the easiest questions. But if you fail to illustrate, if you fail to explain, if you fail to show, then you are losing your marks. Simple questions like who is the persona of the poem? And the question carries either 2 or 3 marks. You need to identify the persona and then you need to pick a few lines from the stanza that show that indeed this is the persona. But once the question asks you, who is the persona of the poem? And you say child and you leave it at that, you are likely going to lose marks. When it comes to poetry, you need to master your question answering techniques. Remember to illustrate each point that you are being asked on. Illustrate using lines from the poem. You can pick lines from the poem and write them and put them in quotation marks to illustrate your points. I think that is that is just a way of how to prepare for KCSE English Paper 2 Poetry. On that note, we come to the end of KCSE Paper 2 Poetry. Join me again on another series of KCSE Paper 2 Grammar. Bye.